Since the early days of comics, superheroes represented the descendants to the classic tales of legend. Yet in 1970, DC Comics received a new pantheon of gods: Highfather, Darkseid, Orion, and Mr. Miracle, all created by Jack Kirby. The new gods were born.
You know, when people talk about Jack Kirby, you know, you start to cover such an intensely brilliant body of work.
Jack Kirby's story, I think for this purpose, starts at the Fleischer Studios. He was a very young animator. That was before he touched comics. He went from there to become one of the very first generation of comic book artists, and probably in partnership with his then partner Joe Simon, the first star talent in our business.
Born Jacob Kurtzberg, New York City, August 28, 1917. He was commonly known by his pen name, Jack Kirby. Widely known to fans as Jack King Kirby.
He made it all about composition and about layout. And he embraced the fact that he could have bold colors on top of each other but still make something dynamic. He started experimenting with things like how panels were placed, that you could have different sizes here and there, that you could have some action sprawl across 2 pages. He would play with a sound effect balloon becoming the panel, outlining the panel, something like kaboom becoming the panel itself as you see a character hit. People just didn't do that before.
There are so many places and so many ways you can highlight his career. You forget that he was around in the 40s. You forget that he was part of a team that first introduced Captain America. You don't realize that he was part of the resurgence of comics with the introduction of Fantastic Four.
He was an incredibly hardworking, energetic artist, and he was always pushing the limits.
He was a celebrated artist who co-created with Stan Lee some of the most popular Marvel comics before ultimately leaving in 1970 to work for rival DC.
This was the equivalent of a trade for Babe Ruth or the ultimate free agent signing in comic books. And to have him come over and not only to do 1 but 4 titles simultaneously, writing and drawing, at a point that one person could make a true difference on the line, is pretty spectacular. For me, New Gods was probably the first work that I identified clearly as Jack Kirby.
I was reading these comics when they came out. I was a comics fan. I was in art school at the time. When it came out, I think there were 3 issues of Jimmy Olsen, and then the books began to roll out 1 every 2 weeks. There was 4 books, they were bi-monthly, and they came out in a rolling order. What that meant was, instead of getting a straight storyline about whatever the adventure was, what you got was a braided storyline, basically a patchwork that gradually filled in over time.
Yeah, the first thing he does when he arrives here is to do something that breaks every rule of comics up until that time. It looks commonplace now, but no one had ever created a comic that interlocked 3 or 4 different publications from the launch. The idea of building a complete universe and launching different characters whose destinies fit together hadn't been tried in comics. This was an astounding moment for comic fans.
Kirby wanted to locate a way to make his work unique. He looked for a common theme among the different comic books being produced, something which unified all the work.
The idea of the New Gods is that there was originally a race in the DC universe who were so old and powerful that they eventually became known as the Old Gods by other races. They had a war during an age called the Third World that blew up their planet, the god planet Urgund. That sector of space was so wrecked by these cosmic forces that it became removed slightly from the rest of the universe. It was slightly out of phase of reality. The remains of this planet, which was orbiting the same star, then formed into two new planets. One was very lush and full of life that became New Genesis. The other was a barren wasteland that became Apokolips.
Heavily inspired by the stories of early mythology, Kirby reached into the Norse legend of Ragnarok, a series of events which told of the death of the major gods. From the smoldering ruins of this battle emerged Kirby's new pantheon, forged through bloodshed and infamy.
On Apokolips, there was a guy, Uzas, who was the son of its ruler, Yuga Khan and Hegra. He eventually rose to power. He had his brother Drax killed in a process by which he got the powerful Omega Force. And in doing so, he became now the stone-like god Darkseid.
Darkseid is the heir to the throne of Apokolips, the world of evil. Highfather is the heir to the throne of New Genesis, the bright and shining world. And as young men, they come into conflict with each other through, in part, a scheme that Darkseid has set up. Highfather's wife is killed. The planets come to miserable levels of war with each other. Cosmic destruction between good and evil. Now the rulers of their respective worlds, Highfather and Darkseid, make the pact. They agree that there'll be a time of peace, and as hostages, they give their sons to each other to raise.
When the pact broke down, the two sons of the Titans, Orion and Scott-Free, rebelled against their surrogate fathers in an attempt to locate the truth to their existence. The father and son struggle tore apart the universe of New Genesis and Apokolips.
New Gods from the very first page was about the greater than life characters, you know. It really is the concept, and the title, New Gods alone, pretty much explain what they are and what they're about.
It is a really interesting mix of like science fiction concepts and basic mythology, you know, Earth mythology, and a big heaping helping of biblical elements.
He saw the whole world of the fourth world taking place after Ragnarok. The last Yuga had ended, the universe had gone with it.
He chose to present the war to the reader at 4 different levels of involvement, of engagement. The first level, the New Gods, was the war seen from the point of view of the major warriors, the major gladiators at the god level who did really the down and dirty fighting. The Forever People, next book in line, is the war seen from the point of view of the children of the gods. For them, the war was an adventure, and it was high adventure. It was an adventure that was dangerous, which they understood, could cost them their lives. Their lives were at hazard a number of times over the run of that book, but it was adventure with a capital A. And in Jimmy Olsen, the 4th book that Jack did, we see the war from the mortal point of view. We really see it as it devolves down to a level of ordinary people, well, relatively ordinary, on Earth and how it affects them.
I think in the fan world, it was one of the most exciting things of the period.
This was a saga to him, a modern mythology.
As war erupted, Darkseid would use every ounce of conflict to rip the life from all that is good.
Darkseid's single motivation is to make sure that not only just his world, but the entire universe subjugates to his will.
In Kirby's work, he was so beautifully written. His scenes with Desaad, his scenes with Forever People, even the scenes with Orion. He's completely cool. He's completely, as a good villain should be, he's completely after or focused really on what he wants. In his case, what Jack came to refer to as the anti-life equation.
Difficult to quantify, the anti-life equation was designed to showcase Darkseid's intelligence. Darkseid realized that if humans exist with life, then anti-life must be present as the balance. And somewhere in there was the key to his control of every living being.
My sense as a reader of the early stories was that Jack's view was the anti-life equation was just the cessation of freedom of thought, freedom of choice. The idea of being a pure drone in the worshipful army of Darkseid. And Darkseid believed it was hidden in the minds of humans on Earth, and in the early stories tried to use a number of different methodologies to kind of tease it out.
Early on in the New Gods, High Father says, life is choice, life is free will, therefore anti-life is the complete eradication of free will. So this was a very cosmic battle from the outgoing.
If Darkseid obtains this, his will rule the universe. There will be no free choice. Essentially, Darkseid's will be the only choice.
You know, it all gives it one mind and one mind under the control of Darkseid. He was able to spread that will and have that level of control over Apocalypse, but naturally challenges came when he tried to take on New Genesis or when he tried to attack Earth or even spread beyond the rest of the universe.
What Jack Kirby emphasized, the calculating, manipulative nature of Darkseid, and the fact that even more than perhaps he wants to control the universe, he loves corrupting it.
Well, the power of Darkseid for the readers is that he has this absolute level of evil, but kind of a tuning fork true note of a perverse kind of honor. But you see in him something that is a dangerous force in the universe. He is darkness. He is something that's ready to claim all life and reconfigure it. And it's an extraordinarily great visual.
Like the Greek and Roman pantheon, the new gods were eternal, but this design was not always the intention.
Jack's mythology allowed the death of gods. It followed really the classic European mythologies in that the gods were timeless and incredibly powerful, but not necessarily invulnerable to each other's actions.
Darkseid has his weaknesses, you know, and the new gods constantly challenge him. I always say the greatest threat to Darkseid is not Superman, but Orion. A savagery to who Darkseid is that I don't think that's a line that Superman would ever cross to completely defeat him. And I think the only way you really take Darkseid down completely is to be able to go over to that side and meet him head on his own terms. It's father versus son, and therefore he knows his father's weaknesses, the father knows the son's weaknesses, and he can meet them on equal footing. So I think there's a battle there.
The thing was, it also became clear that if Kirby wasn't doing Darkseid, he was to be used sparingly. A few times they tried to use him here and there in other stories, and it just wouldn't work quite right. He either seemed too much like an alien rather than a godlike being, or the scheme seemed beneath him.
The New Gods material was fondly remembered, but not very actively a part of the DC mythology. Jerry Conway had done a couple of stories incorporating them into Justice League, trying to revive them in their own book. Neither of those projects had caught on for one reason or another. I was writing Legion of Superheroes. My contribution to the process was I made Darkseid the central figure of what ended up being the most popular or most important arc I wrote on the Legion, the Great Darkness Saga.
Well, one of the things that was interesting about that, again, I'm speaking from a fan's point of view because I read it when it first came out, was that you knew how strong and how powerful Darkseid was. You knew he was a threat. But the fact that he was a threat in the next millennium threw you for a loop. The fact that he existed this long, he outlived the heroes he fought. So in that sense, he sort of won, because he's outlived everything that he was up against. So he was the last man standing in some way. And then to raise up against, and then to be part of this future, and to be challenged in the future the same way he challenged the past, shows him to be a perpetual threat to all of mankind.
For me, it was a chance to play with this great toy that I loved that Jack had created. I liked doing things that linked the 30th Century Legion to the 20th century DC universe. And when you looked at the cast of villains, the most logical one to survive 1,000 years was the God of Evil. And to some extent, I guess, not that it elevated Darkseid, but it reminded people that Darkseid was a great character.
Contrary to Kirby's original plans for the New Gods, it appeared DC Comics had great use for Darkseid.
You don't want to ultimately defeat, Darkseid, because then you can't use him as a bad guy anymore, and he's too good a bad guy to throw away.
Part of the thing that in the DC universe is it's a collaborative effort. And in a sense, that makes it a collaborative universe.
Like a juggernaut, Darkseid's influence extended well beyond his comic book appearances. In shows like Super Friends and Superman the Animated Series, Darkseid became the premier villain fans would love to see from week to week.
Darkseid had wonderful potential for animation. We brought him in first in updating Super Friends into Superpowers.
People always complain who don't read comic books that they think Superman doesn't have anyone. They can really give him a challenge, and here's a guy who, yes, absolutely, every fiber of his being says he's a threat to Superman. It was great seeing them fight in the Superpowers cartoon back in the 80s. It was cool when they upped it a little notch in the Superman animated series. They continued that into the Justice League animated series. Each time they've gone a little bit darker with him, bringing him a little closer to his comic book roots.
In the new DC Comics film, Superman Batman Apocalypse, he matured into a refined villain with an unparalleled agenda.
Do not hesitate. Kill him.
As you wish, Lord Darkseid.
I think it's a fabulous turn of the wheel that certainly Jack would be laughing his head off about, to have a project of this length and this level of investment and effort around the character.
When we approached doing this movie, we had a lot of conversation because Darkseid is so much more than just a nemesis for Superman. He's the ruler of his own kingdom. He's far more powerful than your average supervillain. And the challenge was, okay, how do we deliver Darkseid in a multifaceted and interesting way that pays off in the story, but that doesn't, but isn't short shrift. That doesn't pay short shrift to who he is as a character and to the rest of that world.
Darkseid, even before I joined DC Comics, was one of my favorite villains of DC. That was, and one of the things when I first arrived here was I wanted to make sure that we brought him back to prominence. And to make him really the true threat that he is. It's one thing for Darkseid to be one of the pantheon of DC's heroes, but I don't feel that he ever stood equally with all the others. I always felt he stood above them. These are eternal beings. They're immortal, and they move from avatar to avatar, but they maintain their same essence, their same strengths, and they adapt to whatever environments and changes may be around them. But the real goal is for them to be who they are and challenge everyone around them.
When Jack King Kirby created the Fourth World, it was unknown just how far-reaching the influence of these characters would take into the world of DC Comics, from Darkseid being included as a premier villain in the pages of the Great Darkness Saga, to his newest iterations in the Superman-Batman series. These characters, especially Darkseid, have become some of the most memorable and important of the DC Comics mythology.
It's interesting, in the latest kind of massive conflagration in the DC universe, the New Gods were all killed. and I think they're now back again in some other guise. So, you know, what Jack Kirby has contributed to the DC universe is basically this entire new universe of the New Gods and all of their minions and all of their different plans and how it affects our world.
In comics, you can do awful things to people, and then they kind of get better and they can do other things afterwards. And then they have other story arcs. So the best you can do, I think, really, is you do your own story arc to the best of your ability. You wrap everything up in a way you think will completes the story you want to tell. And then after that, other bards, other skalds, other minstrels will come along, and they will tell their stories of the characters.
One of the things that Jack Kirby trumpeted the most at the creation of these books was the creation of the fourth world. That this is the fourth level of gods. And if there is a new interpretation of reality or the world itself, I have a feeling that not only the new gods would be there, but Darkseid would be there to challenge him.
지시오메수 세체와